Life in 1982, the year technology met imagination. Picture this. It's a Friday night in 1982. You've got $20 in your pocket, a fresh cassette tape in your Walkman, and the whole weekend ahead of you. The arcade on Main Street is calling your name, its neon lights already glowing in the twilight. Your best friend just got an Atari 2600, and there's a new movie out called E.T. that everyone won't stop talking about. Welcome back to Yesterday, Revisited, The Way We Lived. I'm your host, and today we're stepping into 1982, a year that changed everything. This was the moment when technology stopped being something that only existed in laboratories and science fiction, and started appearing in our homes, our pockets, and our daily lives. 1982 was the year Time magazine did something unprecedented. Instead of naming a person of the year, they named a machine of the year, the personal computer. That single decision captured what made 1982 so special. We were standing at the edge of a digital revolution, but we were still living in an analog world. And that combination? That's where the magic happened. So grab your members-only jacket, pop in your Pac-Man cartridge, and let's travel back to 1982, the year technology met imagination. Welcome to the computer age. The first thing you need to understand about computers in 1982 is that they weren't like the sleek devices we know today. These were beige boxes, some the size of a small suitcase, with screens that glowed green or amber, and they were absolutely fascinating. The Commodore 64 launched in August of 1982, and it became one of the most important computers in history. For $595, you could bring home a machine with 64 kilobytes of RAM. Yes, kilobytes, not gigabytes. That's about enough memory to store a single low-resolution photo by today's standards. But back then, it was revolutionary. Families would gather around these computers like they were gathered around televisions a generation before. Dad would be trying to balance the checkbook using VisiCalc. Mom might be typing up work documents. And the kids, they were learning basic programming from magazines, typing in code line by line for hours just to make a simple game work. Here's something that seems almost quaint now. If you wanted software, you didn't download it. You went to a store and bought it on a floppy disk. Those actual floppy disks, the 5.25-inch ones that really did flop. Or you typed the program yourself from a magazine listing. Imagine spending 3 hours typing code, finding one typo, and having to start debugging line by line. The IBM PC had launched the year before in 1981, but 1982 was when businesses really started taking personal computers seriously. Offices began installing these machines, and suddenly secretaries were learning about word processing instead of using typewriters. It wasn't always smooth. Plenty of people resisted, saying they'd never give up their IBM Selectric typewriters. But change was coming whether they liked it or not. Radio Shack's TRS-80 computers were everywhere. So common they were nicknamed Trash 80 by some users, though plenty of people loved them. Apple had the Apple II, which was particularly popular in schools. If you were a kid in 1982, you might have had computer class once a week, where 30 students would share 10 computers, each taking turns typing commands into the green screen monitor. But here's what made 1982 special. Nobody really knew what computers would become. Some people thought they'd be fancy calculators. Others imagined them as home organization tools. The idea that we'd eventually carry computers in our pockets that were millions of times more powerful, that was still pure science fiction. There was this beautiful sense of possibility. Every computer magazine, and there were dozens of them, was filled with predictions about the future, home automation dreams, and debates about whether computers would replace teachers, doctors, or even creative artists. Sound familiar? The conversations we're having about AI today echo the discussions people were having about personal computers in 1982. The arcade revolution. Now, if you wanted to see real computing power in 1982, you didn't go to an office or a home, you went to the arcade. The early 1980s were the golden age of arcade gaming, and 1982 might have been the peak. Walk into any arcade and your senses would be overwhelmed. Dozens of machines lined up, each with its own distinctive sounds. The Waka Waka of Pac-Man, the laser fire of Galaga, the jumping sound effects of Donkey Kong. Neon lights reflected off the screen glass, the smell of cigarette smoke mixed with pizza and popcorn, and quarters. You needed lots of quarters. In 1982, the arcade industry was making more money than the combined movie and music industries. Think about that. Video games weren't some niche hobby, they were mainstream American culture. Ms. Pac-Man came out in 1982, and she became an icon. This wasn't just Pac-Man with a bow. The game had improved AI, new maze designs, and moving bonus fruits. Teenage girls, who hadn't felt welcome in male-dominated arcades, suddenly had a game that felt designed for them. Lines formed just to play her. Tron hit arcades in 1982, based on the Disney movie of the same name. The game's glowing graphics looked like nothing else. It actually used special black light effects to make the screen elements glow. Playing Tron felt like you were inside the computer world from the movie. And then there was Dig Dug. You controlled this little guy with an air pump tunneling through the earth, inflating monsters until they popped. It sounds bizarre when you describe it, but that was the beauty of 1982 arcade games. They could be completely weird, and people loved them for it. Pole Position arrived that year, too, and it revolutionized racing games with its pseudo 3D graphics. You sat in a cabinet with a steering wheel, a gear shift, and a gas pedal. The track would scroll toward you, and you actually felt like you were racing. It was as close to virtual reality as 1982 could get. But arcades were more than just games. They were social spaces. You'd meet your friends there on Friday nights. You'd watch the really good players learning their strategies. There was always that one kid who could beat Donkey Kong on a single quarter while you burned through $5 trying to reach the third level. High scores meant something. Your initials on the top of the leaderboard were a badge of honor. Some people would stand guard over their high score, ready to defend it if anyone got close. There were local legends, kids who were known throughout the neighborhood for their gaming skill. And here's something we don't think about much today. Arcade games were designed to eat quarters. They had to be challenging enough that you'd fail relatively quickly, but fun enough that you'd pump in another quarter to try again. Game designers were psychologists, carefully calibrating difficulty to maximize both enjoyment and profit. Some games, like Dragon's Lair, which came out in 1983, cost 50 cents per play instead of the usual 25 cents, because they used Laserdisc technology and offered movie-quality animation. The arcade experience simply cannot be replicated today. Yes, you can download these games. Yes, they're available on every platform imaginable. But something is lost when you're playing alone in your room with infinite continues, no one watching over your shoulder, and nothing at stake except pixels on a screen. Music in your pocket. While computers were moving into homes and arcades were eating quarters, another revolution was happening, one that changed how we experience music forever. The Sony Walkman. The Walkman had actually launched in 1979, but by 1982, it had become a cultural phenomenon. Suddenly, music was portable in a way it had never been before. Sure, you could carry a transistor radio, but that meant listening to whatever the DJ played. The Walkman meant carrying your music, your choice, wherever you went. In 1982, a Walkman cost around $150, about $470 in today's money. Not cheap, but teenagers saved up for them, put them on Christmas lists, and coveted them like nothing else. Having a Walkman meant freedom. You could tune out the world, create your own soundtrack, disappear into music while riding the bus, walking to school, or just lying in your bedroom. The ritual of making mixtapes became an art form. You'd sit by the radio with your finger on the record button, waiting for your favorite song to come on. You'd record songs from friends' albums onto blank tapes. Creating the perfect mixtape for someone, especially someone you had a crush on, required thought and strategy. Which songs? In what order? What did the sequence say about your feelings? Music in 1982 was wildly diverse. MTV had launched the year before, in August 1981, and by 1982, it was changing how people discovered and experienced music. For the first time, you didn't just hear a song, you saw it. Michael Jackson's Thriller wouldn't come out until later in the year, but songs like Soft Cell's Tainted Love and Joan Jett's I Love Rock and Roll dominated both radio and the new music video format. The great thing about 1982 music was that different genres coexisted. New wave bands like Duran Duran and the Human League used synthesizers to create sounds that felt futuristic. Meanwhile, rock bands like Journey and Foreigner topped the charts with power ballads. Hip-hop was emerging from New York City, though it wouldn't hit the mainstream for a few more years, and country music was thriving, with artists like Willie Nelson and Alabama filling stadiums. If you wanted to buy music in 1982, you went to a record store, an actual physical location filled with vinyl records, cassette tapes, and those newfangled compact discs that most people didn't have players for yet. You'd flip through bins of albums, looking at cover art, reading liner notes. The store employees were usually music obsessives who could recommend albums based on what you already liked. And listening to an album was an event. You'd take it home, carefully remove the plastic wrap, pull out the vinyl record without touching the grooves, and place it gently on your turntable. You'd read the liner notes while listening, studying the lyrics, looking at the photos. An album was a complete artistic statement, not just a collection of potential singles. The Walkman changed all that. Suddenly, music became background to your life instead of the main event. You could soundtrack your morning jog, your afternoon studying, your evening hanging out with friends. It was the beginning of music as constant companion, the ancestor of everyone walking around today with AirPods permanently installed in their ears. Everyday life in the analog-digital transition. So what was daily life actually like in 1982 as we stood on this threshold between the old world and the new? Let's start with communication. If you wanted to talk to someone, you called them on a phone, a landline, attached to the wall by a cord. No caller ID, no voicemail in most homes. The phone would ring, and it was a mystery who was calling until you picked up. Teenagers would stretch those coiled phone cords as far as they could go, trying to have private conversations while tethered to the kitchen wall. Long-distance calls cost money. Real money. You'd save long-distance calls for important occasions. Calling a friend in another state meant keeping conversations short, watching the clock. Phone bills itemized every long-distance call, and parents would scan them looking for unauthorized numbers. If you wanted to send a message without calling, you wrote a letter. Not an email, an actual letter with pen and paper, placed in an envelope with a stamp, dropped in a mailbox. And then you waited. 3 days, maybe a week, before a response might arrive. The idea of instant communication didn't exist outside of phone calls. Television was completely different too. In 1982, most Americans got 3 major networks: ABC, CBS, NBC, plus maybe a couple of local stations. Cable TV was expanding, and by 1982, about 30% of American homes had it. If you had cable, you might get MTV, ESPN, CNN, which had launched in 1980, and maybe 15 or 20 other channels. Today, that sounds impossibly limited, but back then, having 30 channels felt like infinite choice. There were no DVRs, no streaming, no on-demand anything. If a show came on Tuesday at 8 p.m., you watched it Tuesday at 8 p.m., or you missed it. Entire offices would discuss the previous night's episode of shows like Dallas or MASH around the water cooler. Everyone saw the same thing at the same time, creating a shared cultural experience that's almost impossible to replicate today. Going to the movies was a major outing. In 1982, you had extraordinary choices. E.T. the Extraterrestrial became the highest-grossing film of all time. Blade Runner showed us a dystopian future that looked like nothing we'd seen before. Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan revitalized that franchise. Tron tried to visualize the inside of a computer. Poltergeist scared us half to death. Rocky III had us cheering. But here's the thing. Once a movie left theaters, that was it. You couldn't watch it again unless you waited months for it to show up on television, heavily edited, and interrupted by commercials. The VCR was starting to change that, but in 1982, VCRs were expensive, around $600 to $800, and the format war between VHS and Betamax was still raging. Shopping was a completely physical experience. If you wanted to buy something, you went to a store. No online shopping, no price comparisons with your phone, no reviews to read. You looked at products, asked salespeople questions, made decisions based on what you could see and touch right there. If the store didn't have it, you might call other stores, or you just go without. Credit cards existed, but many people still didn't have them or rarely used them. Cash and checks were the primary payment methods. Balancing your checkbook was a monthly ritual, comparing your records against the bank statement that arrived in the mail. Photography meant film. You take a roll of pictures, 24 or 36 shots, then take the film to be developed. Days later, you'd pick up your prints and hope that some of them turned out well. You couldn't see what you'd photographed until then. Bad photos stayed in the envelope, never to be seen. Good photos went into physical albums. The idea of taking hundreds of photos of the same thing, then deleting the bad ones, was impossible. Kids played outside. Not because they were more virtuous or healthy than modern kids, but because there wasn't that much to do inside. 3 TV channels, a handful of video game cartridges that you'd played 100 times, board games you knew by heart. Outside meant bikes, skateboards, pick-up basketball games, exploring the neighborhood, building forts, getting into minor mischief. Parents sent kids outside after breakfast and expected them back when the streetlights came on. School meant handwriting everything. Term papers were typed on typewriters, with correction fluid for mistakes. Research meant going to the library, using the card catalog, checking out books, taking notes on index cards. Copying information meant writing it out by hand or using a photocopier. The internet wasn't available to help with homework, so you actually had to read encyclopedias or hope your teacher explained things clearly. The culture of 1982. The culture of 1982 had a distinctive style and attitude. This was the year when the 1970s finally gave way to something new, something that felt simultaneously futuristic and nostalgic. Fashion in 1982 was bold. Neon colors weren't just accepted, they were encouraged. Bright pink, electric blue, lime green, often all in the same outfit. Leg warmers, headbands, and sweatbands were everywhere, partly thanks to the aerobics craze sweeping the nation. Jane Fonda's workout videos were bestsellers. Looking athletic was fashionable, even if you never set foot in a gym. For men, members-only jackets were the height of cool. Those thin, zippered jackets with the little belt buckle on the chest. Miami Vice wouldn't premiere until 1984, but the pastel-colored t-shirt underblazer look was already emerging. Polo shirts with popped collars, tight-rolled jeans, high-top sneakers, preferably Converse or Nike. Women's fashion embraced big hair. The bigger, the better. Shoulder pads made business suits look powerful and angular. Madonna was just about to explode onto the scene with her distinctive style of layered bracelets, lace gloves, and messy hair with a bow. The Reagan era was in full swing, and conspicuous consumption was celebrated. Greed is good wasn't just a line from Wall Street. It was becoming a cultural attitude. It was yuppies, young urban professionals, were a new social category. People in their 20s and 30s making good money and not afraid to spend it on the best of everything. At the same time, there was a counterculture emerging. Punk rock had evolved into post-punk and new wave. MTV gave visual expression to music that rejected traditional rock aesthetics. The Cold War was still very real. People genuinely worried about nuclear war. Movies like War Games, which would come out the following year, captured that anxiety about computers and nuclear weapons. Technology itself was becoming cool. Before 1982, being into computers marked you as a nerd, probably with tape on your glasses, and a pocket protector. But in 1982, technology started shifting from nerdy to sophisticated. Owning a computer wasn't just for hobbyists anymore, it was forward thinking, professional, modern. The arcade culture reflected this. Yes, there were still nerdy kids who spent every afternoon playing Space Invaders, but there were also cool kids, popular kids, athletes, pretty much everyone, because video games had transcended their geeky origins. Books in 1982 reflected these cultural tensions. Stephen King's Different Seasons came out, containing the novellas that would become The Shawshank Redemption and Stand By Me. Alice Walker published The Color Purple. There was serious literary fiction, genre fiction, self-help books, all coexisting in bookstores that were social spaces where people browsed for hours. Food culture was changing too. Fast food was everywhere. McDonald's, Burger King, Wendy's. But there was also a growing interest in gourmet food, nouvelle cuisine, and dining as experience, rather than just sustenance. TV dinners were still common, but so were fondue parties and dinner parties where people tried to impress each other with exotic dishes. Saturday morning cartoons were a sacred ritual for kids. You'd wake up early, pour yourself a bowl of sugary cereal, the more artificial colors the better, and watch Scooby-Doo, Smurfs, and G.I. Joe. The commercials were targeted directly at children, selling toys and more cereal. It was pure, unfiltered consumerism aimed at 8-year-olds, and nobody thought twice about it. What 1982 meant. So why does 1982 matter? Why is it worth revisiting? Because 1982 was a hinge point. It was the last year of the old world and the first year of the new world, both at the same time. People in 1982 could remember a time without computers, without video games, without portable music. But they could also see, dimly, the future rushing toward them. The technology that seemed so revolutionary in 1982, Walkmans, personal computers, arcade games, was just the beginning. The seeds planted that year would grow into the internet, smartphones, social media, streaming services, all the digital infrastructure we take for granted today. But here's what's beautiful about 1982. The technology hadn't taken over yet. It was still a tool, a toy, an addition to life rather than the foundation of it. You could own a computer and the Walkman and spend your Friday nights at the arcade, but you also still wrote letters, made phone calls, met friends in person, and existed in physical spaces with physical objects. The people of 1982 were pioneers, whether they knew it or not. Every kid typing basic code into a Commodore 64, every teenager pumping quarters into Donkey Kong, every office worker learning word processing, they were building the bridge to our present. And maybe that's why 1982 feels so magical when we look back. It was complex enough to be interesting, but simple enough to be comprehensible. The whole world wasn't in your pocket yet, demanding your constant attention. Technology was exciting precisely because it was new and limited and full of possibility. When Time magazine named the computer as Machine of the Year, they were acknowledging something important. We were entering an age where machines would shape our lives in fundamental ways. They couldn't have known just how right they were, how completely computers would infiltrate every aspect of existence. But in 1982, that future was still just beginning. The arcade lights still glowed, the cassette tapes still played, the computers still beeped and booped with 8-bit sounds, and for one brief, beautiful moment, technology met imagination, and anything seemed possible. Thanks for joining me on this journey back to 1982. If you lived through that year, I hope this brought back some memories. If you didn't, I hope you got a sense of what it was like to stand at the edge of the digital revolution. What were your experiences with technology in the early 1980s? Do you remember your first computer, your first video game, your first Walkman? Share your stories in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this trip back in time, please like this video and subscribe to Yesterday Revisited, the way we lived for more explorations of how we used to live. Until next time, keep looking back, because sometimes the past helps us understand the present,